Thank you all for being here today. I am Meenakshi Srinivasan, the 11th Chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and on behalf of the Commission and our co-sponsors, Gerald Caden, Professor at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, Christina Davis, Chair of the Landmarks Preservation Foundation, the New York Bar Association, and the American Institute of Architects, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our conference, History in the Making, New York City's Landmarks Law at 50. This conference marks 50 years of New York's groundbreaking law, as well as the Landmarks Preservation Commission. While not the first preservation law in the country, New York's would be the vehicle, the test case, for the Supreme Court to rule that historic preservation is a constitutionally appropriate exercise of the city's police powers to protect and advance public health and welfare. As Justice Brennan wrote in his majority opinion in Penn Central, it is a widely shared belief that structures with special historic, cultural, and architectural significance enhance the quality of life for all. Consequently, today, people believe that preservation of historically significant structures and districts is fundamental to their well-being, and societal expectations that municipalities ensure this public benefit has become commonplace. 50 years is a long time, and the Landmarks Law has seen some changes over the years. The addition of the power to designate interiors and scenic landmarks, the ability to designate as need arises instead of a 3-year schedule as originally approved, and finally, the enactment of a rigorous administrative enforcement system. All good and necessary amendments to make the law more flexible and effective. This milestone year is a perfect opportunity for us to think critically about the law's history and its application over the past 5 decades. And so we, as a cross-section of stakeholders, participants with different voices, can consider how it can best function over the next 50 years. In bringing such a dynamic group of people together, we are optimistic that the remarkable dialogue will unfold. I'm happy to see so many of my fellow commissioners here today. Commissioner Adi Shamir Barron, I think she's here, Fred Bland, Wellington Chen, and John Gustafson, all who volunteer their time and resources in fulfilling this important public service to New York. I also believe that several of our past commission members are here, including Chairs Beverly Moss-Pat and Kent Barwick, who will be participating in the afternoon session. All the past chairs have led and contributed to the agency's success. There are also several Landmarks Preservation Board members here today, and I welcome them. I would now like to introduce an amazing person who actually needs no introduction at all. Holding the title as the most powerful woman in New York today, and a tour de force of the New York scene, she's a great supporter of the Landmarks Preservation Commission by seating us firmly at the table with city planning, housing, and economic development, and recognizing us as a critical player and partner in New York's future. Under her leadership and purse strings, the agency has grown by 15% in our resources, a clear commitment to our cause. And now it is with great pride and admiration I would like to introduce my boss, Deputy Mayor Alicia Glenn.
Wow, thank you. That was so nice. So first of all, this is very exciting for me. I am a recovering lawyer, so I feel like I'm sort of back at home, but I'm also very nervous with all of these very serious-looking people staring at me from the walls. But I'm also mostly nervous and excited. I'm testing out a new technology today as I approach my evolution as also being in charge of technology. I'm going to try to do my remarks from my iPad today. So this for me is an exciting moment, and I think it should go well, but I just want to warn you ahead of time, if I lose the screen, we'll have a very dramatic pause. But I do want to thank everybody for being here today, and obviously Meenakshi, who is not just an amazing landmark person with respect to her leading the chair, being the chair of the commission, but also for many, many years of dedication to city service. I think those of us who are in city government don't actually really appreciate enough when somebody does this for as many years as Meenakshi has done and taken on many different hats. We are really the recipient of your wisdom for many, many years of your work in New York, and I know that my work is much better because of it, and we're very lucky to have you, and I really mean that. I also want to thank everybody who is participating in today's symposium and really recognize a lot of what's sort of the heroic efforts of preservationists, designers, elected officials, many of the civic groups, and of course all the current and past commissioners who are part of this amazing legacy that we're celebrating and discussing today. It really is a community, and I sense that when I work on these issues. Look, I think it's fair to say that New York City, what makes New York City so amazing is that it is a constantly evolving city, where the old and the new constantly mix, and sometimes they collide. But that collision can really produce a singular and dynamic place. And over the past 50 years, I have to say I'm so excited that I'm not quite 50 yet, so I'm pretty excited that I have this moment to sort of map my own life to this. But over the past 50 years, I've lived this, and I think it's fairly clear to say that the Landmarks Law has played an unbelievably integral role in ensuring that the city's most significant buildings and their sites and the historically significant neighborhoods are protected and celebrated. I think without the law, it's pretty clear that market dynamics could have left us with a very, very different city. But we're also a city that the past has to inform the future, right? And it shouldn't and it need not impede change or innovation, right? Because let's face it, I mean, what makes New York City unique, if sometimes exasperating or contentious, is the richness of this history, and it's often played out in debates around the built environment and or how our economic future should be shaped. Let me just sort of bring that down to something concrete when I think about my own experience again, and what my daughters always say, a real-life example of my work. I am a lifelong New Yorker, and I've grown up on the Upper West Side, and I grew up, as many people did on the West Side, going to the Hayden Planetarium at the Natural History Museum. And you can imagine, as a kid and a teenager, there was some pretty interesting stuff going on in there, which we won't necessarily talk about today. But I was horrified, as most people were, when we heard of the plans to knock it down. Nothing in my mind was more New York than that structure, right? The whole fate, the gestalt of New York City and the Upper West Side was literally hanging in the balance by that building being taken down. And then I sort of fast forward 15 years later, or 15 or 16 years later, and I take my two daughters to what is now known as the Rose Center, and I'm literally blown away by how beautiful the physical structure is and how well the contemporary architecture works, not just only with the surrounding neighborhood, but also with the traditional structure itself, and how incredible the programming is that's going on in that building, and how it, in many ways, made two science-phobic little girls look at the world with very new eyes and want to learn more. And I think to myself, how many more emerging researchers and innovators and entrepreneurs have been inspired by that building? And I think they're inspired by it because it's so integrated into that unbelievable landmark structure. It's literally part of that institution, but it's figuratively grounded and literally grounded in the past. So I mention this because obviously building the Rose Center was not without controversy, nor were many other landmarks, whether it was the first interior landmark at the Four Seasons restaurants or any other ones that I can think of in my own political history that I've been involved in. But all of those decisions have really helped shape the New York of today. And so when we think about the future, what does our administration want to do? Our administration's goal is to protect and promote the buildings and the neighborhoods that exemplify the diverse and rich fabric of New York, while simultaneously embracing and catalyzing growth that will allow us to remain the global center of commerce and culture. And that can be a foundation and a model for a truly equitable and dynamic world city. And I think I just want to make this really clear. I think despite some of the chatter, in the blogs and in the press, to the contrary, we are committed to preservation and understand how preservation is absolutely critical to attaining those broader goals. So just to give you some of the facts, this administration has already added significantly to the roster of landmarks. The Commission has designated nearly 2,000 buildings over the past 21 months. That's 7 times more buildings than were designated at the start of the prior administration. And we are absolutely determined to make sure that conversations about historic resources don't simply focus on the city's past, but are fully integrated into the future, because that is really smart preservation. So it's no longer its own silo. The LPC doesn't sit out on its own, distinct from our other planning efforts and economic development objectives. We are making the Commission a true partner in our citywide agenda, including how we are approaching our plan to rezone East Midtown, where the LPC is playing an integral role in efforts to identify opportunities for landmark designation, as well as our more neighborhood-based rezonings that are so critical to reaching our ambitious but necessary housing goals. So again, simply put, I just want to state the obvious to everybody in the room. Preservation and development can go hand in hand and will and do reinforce each other. We know this to be true. We've seen this play out in vibrant and commercially successful neighborhoods like Soho, Dumbo, the Broadway Theater District, all of which greatly benefit from their historic character alongside significant economic development. So our focus will remain on supporting equitable development, including preservation, recognizing historic resources that exist far and wide throughout the 5 boroughs, and particularly in neighborhoods that have not received much focus necessarily in the past. I think we're all a little guilty of being Manhattan-centric. So let me give you 2 examples of things we've done that I think really epitomize the work the Commission is doing. Last spring, we designated Stone Avenue branch of the Brooklyn Public Library in Brownsville. It was one of the few undesignated Carnegie-era libraries and was the first children's library in the country. It's an astonishing building. You should really go out there. And then more recently, we designated the Stonewall Inn, recognized primarily for its significance to the LGBT history, and adding to other cultural landmarks. Again, celebrating culture as much as architecture. Cultural landmarks like the Louis Armstrong House in Queens and the Edgar Allan Poe Cottage in the Bronx. All of this work is aimed to foster a conducive environment for creating the next generation of landmarks and meeting the evolving needs of everyday New Yorkers without compromising the rich past that we celebrate today. And again, that is what makes New York City unique. We're not Phoenix. We are New York because we have this healthy mix of new and old. We can and will embrace growth and innovation without undermining what makes New York, New York. One last thought. I was thinking about this morning. Landmark buildings themselves are constantly reinventing themselves through adaptive reuse. I can't tell you how much this is true as I look at my iPad right now. They are the absolute darlings, the choice for tech startups and other innovation economy companies. Houses in historic districts command higher prices. So we know that there is real value in the law and the policies adapted to implement the law. But we also have to be wary, and we know that the law needs to be flexible and that forums like this one are vital as the city confronts today's challenges like affordability, sustainability, and resilience. I think the point is that the law itself has to live and breathe and adapt to the city we both are and the city we will become and need to become in order to maintain the greatness that is New York. So I look forward to working with all of you as we welcome the next 50 years of the Landmarks Law. Hopefully I'll still be here in 50 years, because then I'll be 99. And it will be another amazing discussion around how both the past and the future work to promote our collective objectives. Have a wonderful, wonderful symposium. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. That's all terrific. 50 years old. The Landmarks Preservation Law is, yes, Alicia, middle-aged. On the one hand, it is experienced, well-tested, mature. On the other hand, is there a midlife crisis looming? Middle age does necessarily promote some degree of stock-taking, of soul-searching, especially with regard to how the stewards of New York City, everybody, want to see landmarks and historic districts protected within the context of a growing, economically vibrant, and diverse city. So let me start by simply complimenting the Landmarks Preservation Commission and Meenakshi Srinivasan, its chair, for accepting the challenge of co-sponsoring a conference of this sort, which will involve glances at its own work, and indeed, perhaps with a critical eye as we look ahead and do the work for the future. It's very easy to do a conference that's not attached to an official agency, but it's far less usual in my experience for an agency to do this, and I think that's a great testament to a confidence about what one is doing, to be able to look positively and critically as well. It is worth recognizing when one celebrates or marks an anniversary about how revolutionary the Landmarks Law was when it was enacted 50 years ago. Local regulation of the built environment through much of the 20th century was handled, indeed still is handled, by another legal instrument. We all know it, zoning. And zoning centered at that time on regulating primarily new development, where development would be located, how large it would be in terms of form, its shape, its density, et cetera. Zoning on its face never expressed a preference for old versus new. Even as it regulated and controlled, zoning also created expectations among landowners that they would be able to develop, that they own something that could be understood speculatively as a real estate asset, creating certain kinds of pressures within cities and towns. Zoning, of course, by definition, was about zones. Some people say, why is it called zoning? Well, it's because it's about zones or districts. And these zones or districts would be governed by uniform rules. Anything less than a robust zone would raise the specter of what people would call illegal spot zoning. Zoning, at least in theory, also would be, and I emphasize at least in theory, in accordance with a comprehensive plan. That was the original language under the Model State Zoning Enabling Act, and even in New York State and many other states, that there would be a separate plan. It doesn't mean it's happened, but there would always be a comprehensive plan of some sort, comprehensive in terms of territory, in terms of subject matter covered, and in terms of time over many, many years. Now, New York City's Landmarks Law, on the other hand, supplemented or indeed outright rejected many of zoning's fundamental ideas. The Landmarks Law, first of all, plugged a large hole in the zoning regime. How does a city think about existing buildings and their contribution to the community? The Landmarks Law expressly authorized the regulation of specified individual idiosyncratic named buildings, and one can't emphasize enough how revolutionary this was, cutting against the foundational uniformity principle that underlies zoning itself. The Landmarks Law relied in all that it does primarily on case-by-case adjudications, case-by-case decision-making, rather than on zoning's rule-based approach. That's not to suggest that all of zoning is rule-based. To be sure, we have discretionary special permits that are issued, et cetera, but this was foundationally different in terms of the case-by-case. Most important, I think, the Landmarks Law did set up a separate regime that privileged one purpose of the built environment above all others. It was something of a blunt instrument, intentionally, that did not take into account, at least in part of its decision-making process, all interests served by the built environment. Now, that, of course, leads to the questions many have posed, and that Alicia alluded to at the end of her remarks, whether the Landmarks Law has, well, become too much of a law unto itself, without regard to equally important interests in the city. And of course, that's in the discussion, whether it's in the blogs and chatter rooms of today, and it will be discussed today. Well, I did something revolutionary myself in the past week or so, which is I went back and I reread the Landmarks Law itself. Now, I had read it many years ago, but it's something that we actually don't do. And for those of you who haven't reread the law recently, and by the way, for those of you who haven't read the law, I actually commend it. we are doing a conference about a law, and it's actually quite interesting to determine what the founders, and I'm looking at Ruth Bader Ginsburg right across from me, what the founders had in mind when they actually drafted this law. And it's very, very evident, I think, in the law itself. It's always interesting to read purposes sections, and here it's especially illuminating. And it's hardly as narrow as one might actually remember, so I will read it. The purpose of this chapter is to A, affect and accomplish the protection, enhancement, and perpetuation of such improvements and landscape features and of districts which represent or reflect elements of the city's cultural, social, economic, political, and architectural history. Okay, so far, that's the standard landmarks law. B, safeguard the city's historic, aesthetic, and cultural heritage as embodied and reflected in such improvements, landscape features, and districts. Okay? C, stabilize and improve property values in such districts. Well, that's interesting, even arguably provocative. D, foster civic pride in the beauty and noble accomplishments of the past. E, protect and enhance the city's attractions to tourists and visitors, and the support and stimulus to business and industry thereby provided. F, strengthen the economy of the city. And G, promote the use of historic districts, landmarks, interior landmarks, and scenic landmarks for the education, pleasure, and welfare of the people of the city. This is hardly a narrow purposes section talking solely about classic historic preservation. Yes, to be sure, the law wants to preserve this McKim, Mead, and White building and that George Washington slept here house. But the law is far broader in what it is trying to accomplish. It not only seeks to preserve the standard trio, cultural, social, architectural heritage, but it wants to strengthen the economy, tourism, business, etc. Although the law does render the LPC, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, largely blinded in what it does, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment, designating landmarks, interior landmarks, scenic landmarks, and historic districts using standard landmarks criteria, the law does make clear that there are other overriding considerations that may be brought in by others. All right, so the process introduces the other considerations and actors that may bring in other interests. Within 10 days after the LPC designates a landmark or a historic district, it has to file a copy of that designation with various city agencies, the City Council, Department of Buildings, City Planning Commission, Board of Standards and Appeals, the Fire Department, and the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, which of course is the key actor in everything that happened. Within 60 days of that filing, the City Planning Commission shall hold public hearings on historic districts, submit reports to the City Council on historic districts and landmarks, quote, with respect to the relation of such designation, whether of a historic district or a landmark, to the zoning resolution, projected public improvements, and any plans for the development, growth, improvement, or renewal of the area involved. And it must include a recommendation, I love this, if it has one, about historic districts. I guess it doesn't really have to. It can include a recommendation, which is we don't have a recommendation. And then, of course, the City Council may approve, modify or disapprove. The mayor may disapprove, and the City Council may override the mayor's disapproval. So whatever actually happens in the real world, the law certainly contemplates that other interests in the city may outweigh the landmark interest, and that this is best resolved, generally speaking, outside of the purview of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, resolved by the City Planning Commission with recommendations to the political bodies and by the political bodies. Now, I'm not standing here supporting that regime or opposing that regime. Please do not misunderstand me. I may be in the blogs and the chatter rooms. I don't actually enter into them. But I'm not expressing my opinion here at all. I'm just telling us, reminding us what the law is. Is it enough, too much, or too little of a balancing act? Some fear that anything that unsilos the Landmarks Preservation Commission more than this would upset a delicate balance. Others argue that this process is insufficient to introduce other considerations, such as affordable housing and jobs, that preservation could negatively affect in terms of the realization of those goals. So what could be done were you to have the view that LPC's interests are too narrow or constraining on the growth and development of a diverse city? Well, we already have a deputy mayor, by the way, a talented one, obviously, who presides over all of these people and who has people reporting up to her. LPC, City Planning Commission, Housing Preservation Development, Economic Development. Maybe some people have suggested Carl Weisbrod should be the chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission as well as City Planning Commission. Or, by the way, maybe the reverse. Meenakshi should actually be the chair of both agencies. And by the way, some people have proposed merging the agencies, obviously. Maybe there should be a chapter in the zoning resolution about historic preservation. Maybe we should have an express override. We'll hear from Washington, D.C. about a special merit override, about, maybe landmarks don't always win. Okay, so these are the provocations that can exist on the table. And then others might argue there's not enough protection. We're moving in this discussion away from, and it's dangerous. And we have to actually come up with proposals to silo more or to make these decisions more absolute perhaps than the law initially anticipated they would be. Does the law itself encourage the Landmarks Preservation Commission to participate more broadly in policy and planning discussions about landmarking? Interestingly, the law does anticipate that the Landmarks Preservation Commission would make recommendations to the City Planning Commission with respect to amendments to zoning applicable to improvements in historic districts. So there is a flow both ways, from city planning to landmarks, from landmarks to city planning. And in section 25.320, called Investigations and Reports, the Landmarks Preservation Commission is authorized to actually speak more broadly about landmarks policy. Should there be a landmarks plan, a policy that the Landmarks Preservation Commission deals with? Should the Landmarks Preservation Commission indeed become more of a policy agency, not in terms of divining its policy from the various designations it does and the certificates of appropriateness it issues or does not issue, but actually intentionally thinking about landmarks as part of city development, as part of the very life of the city, as opposed to simply, in short, being more of a ministerial agency. Does, by the way, the Landmarks Preservation Commission know enough about the effects of its landmarks programs, not just about the stats that we'll hear about with numbers of landmarks and the like, but the economic effects, the touristic effects, the cultural effects, the place-based effects that make this city so great? Preservation has surely helped to ensure the viability of wonderful neighborhoods. Has it benefited everybody? Has it excluded some people? Are historic districts open to everybody, or are they indeed gentrified neighborhoods? This is something that the Landmarks Preservation Commission itself could study without going beyond the mandate of the law itself. So, we've got a lot of questions for today's conference that will, I hope, be answered more than just generally, but quite specifically. Yes, we'll be asking, has the law been a success? Is the city designating too many or too few landmarks and historic districts? How does it know? Are the costs exceeding the benefits? Is 30 years too long? Should the city adopt a more nuanced system of grading buildings rather than a binary yes-no? Should we be like the British with grade 1 and grade 2, et cetera? Is there a clear line between historic districts and maintaining older neighborhoods? Do current attitudes toward the environment and with new building technologies suggest changes in how certificates of appropriateness should be issued? Should the city expand transfer of development rights receiving districts? Should there be broader skyline protection laws like London's? Do we need to reconceive the very zeitgeist of preservation in a historic age, listening to Rem Koolhaas's lament about the artificiality of much historic preservation, what I've sometimes called the tyranny of context, when it comes to new development in historic areas? So, that's our mandate for the day. I hope it'll be an exciting discussion. And why don't we now turn to our next panel? You all have the order of the day, the program for the day. So without further ado, we turn to our next panel. Thank you very much.